Wow, we're into the Passion Week, starting with Palm Sunday, where Jesus rode a donkey into Jerusalem. We think of Maundy Thursday, where Jesus and the 12 disciples have the last supper together in the upper room. And then we have Good Friday, the death of Jesus Christ on the cross, leading ultimately to the victory that we have on Resurrection Sunday. So today I'd like to take you on a journey to the country of Israel, where many of these events take place. When you open up your Bible, many of the events that you read about take place in the Holy Land, in the Promised Land of Israel. When you're reading about people like Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, when you're reading about New Testament events like the death, the burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. When you're thinking of King David, King Solomon, a lot of these events took place here in the land of Israel. And so today I'd like to take you on a promenade in the Promised Land, the Israel experience. So who's ready to take this trip? Who's ready to take this journey? Well, make sure that you have your passport ready and that your luggage is packed. Make sure you have your clothes ready so that we can get ready to board a plane and head to the other side of the world. So let's get on our plane and we're going to board and we're going to fly to the country of Israel. So here we are in the United States, and for myself, we're here on the east coast of the United States. And so we're going to take a long flight right across the Atlantic Ocean to Israel. It's about a 10 and a half hour flight to go from the United States of America on the East Coast to the country of Israel, across the Atlantic and to the country of Israel. Here's a view as we fly over some of Europe, getting ready to approach into Israel. So welcome to Israel. Wow, that 10 and a half hour flight didn't take any time at all. You've landed at Tel Aviv Airport, Ben Gurion Airport in Tel Aviv on the Mediterranean coast of Israel. So welcome to Israel as we start to explore some of the areas of the Bible. So we're going to look at some things more from a chronological standpoint. So we're first going to be looking at Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So the patriarchs of the Jewish faith. In Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 3, God told Abraham, "Get out of your country, from your family, and from your father's house, to a land that I will show you. I will make you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse him who curses you. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." And that's found in Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 3. And the place that God was talking about was modern-day Israel. And God was going to take Abraham there, and it was going to be a long journey to go from his home in the Mesopotamia area, where modern-day Iraq is, to go to this particular area that was going to be the Promised Land. So one of the areas that's it's actually in northern Israel is this particular location. And in the biblical account of Abraham, there's an account of Abraham rescuing his nephew Lot, who had actually journeyed with him to the land. And it is believed that this particular event that took place, which is in Genesis chapter 14, that when Abraham, or Abram as he was called at the time, is chasing some of these people that kidnapped Lot and several of the people from the city of Sodom. And eventually you have the events, this is all taking place basically in chapter 13 and chapter 14 of Genesis. And then at the end of chapter 14 is where we have the account of Abram and Melchizedek. But you have this particular event of Abraham going and following, trying to find Lot and the people of Sodom that have been kidnapped. And they go up to the north, and it's believed that this particular monument, this Canaanite monument, is one of those areas that was actually in place at that point in time. So it's very possible this is actually a Canaanite gate. It looks sort of like a wall, but that arch there is actually part of a gate as an entrance to a city. And this is in northern Israel. It's sort of about probably around 10 miles or less from the Syrian border. And so this is one of the areas that it's very possible that Abraham saw while he was being a sojourner in the land of Canaan. So this is a particular area that's in that region. And it's been excavated, and it's an archaeological site that you can see in northern Israel. Here's another view of it as a video that you'll be able to see the size of this. So this is something that's, you know, at least a good 4,000 to 5,000 years old, this particular Canaanite structure that's there. So as you're traveling around Israel, another region that sort of plays around with this particular area is the area that's around the Dead Sea. And this is an area that's down near the Dead Sea, and we have these particular fruit trees, and they're growing a certain fruit, but you never want to eat it because it's actually called a Sodom apple. And it's very interesting because the region of Sodom and Gomorrah is believed to be near where the Dead Sea is. But these Sodom apples will kill you, and they're very poisonous. But they looked really pretty down there. But once again, you wouldn't want to eat them if you see them. So that was the waves off of the Dead Sea, and all that discoloration is the salt and the minerals that are there at the Dead Sea. And so the Dead Sea is in sort of southern Israel. It's south of Jerusalem, and this is the particular region where Sodom and Gomorrah is believed to be. And you can sort of see it if you look across is the country of Jordan. You can sort of see it there on the horizon. And there I am floating in the Dead Sea. You can't sink in the Dead Sea, so if you ever go to the Dead Sea, it's definitely an experience because even if you can't swim, you can definitely float. You can't sink. You'd have to tie lead weights on yourself to be able to go to the body. To go under, and so it's a very interesting and surreal experience. The other thing that this area reminded me of around the Dead Sea, and since this was the area where Sodom and Gomorrah is believed to have been, is all the salt, and this is some salt structures that have been built from some of the minerals, and this reminded me when I saw it of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah that takes place in Genesis chapter 19, and the account of Lot and his family being warned by the angels of the Lord to flee, and they were told not to turn and look at the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. But it says that in verse 26 of chapter 19 of Genesis, but his wife looked behind him and she became a pillar of salt. And so here we have some pillars of salt that are near the Dead Sea. So as we transition to the book of Exodus, we look sort of at the accounts of Moses and Joshua. Now Moses never made it into the promised land. But he was able to look into the promised land across the Jordan River. And this is part of the Jordan River in northern Israel. This wouldn't have been the area where Israel crossed over, but if you remember from the account in Joshua, the account of Joshua, that it was during the springtime where there was a lot of flooding that was taking place. And this particular image of the Jordan River in the north is during the summertime when there's definitely a lot less rain. And so there's the view of the Jordan River. And here's another view. This is sort of a little bit further south of where that other image was taken. And we'll see this particular spot a little bit later on as we continue on our journey. Here's where modern-day Jericho is, and it's built close to where ancient Jericho was, but you can see some of the structures there in the background. And Jericho is referred to as the city of palms, and there are still several palm trees that grow in Israel. So there we have the palm trees that are growing near modern-day Jordan and the modern-day Jericho on the Jordan River. So continuing on, we have the time of the judges after the conquest of Canaan, and we move into the story of Naomi, Ruth, and Boaz, which takes place during the time of the judges. And looking across, we see this particular landmass that's over in the modern country of Jordan. So this is looking across the Dead Sea once again. And that modern landmass in Jordan is approximately where Moab is. So we have the story of Naomi and her husband and her two sons, and they went to Moab from Bethlehem to escape a famine. The husband and the two sons die, and Naomi and her daughter-in-laws Ophrah and Ruth come back. She tells both of them to turn back and go back to Moab, but Ruth stays with her. And the journey going back to Bethlehem is a very long and treacherous one, considering the landscape for a part of it would have looked something like this. This is down near the Dead Sea, and this particular pass would have taken you back toward the region of Bethlehem. And this is modern-day Bethlehem. These are up on some of the hillsides around the city of Bethlehem. And so this is where Ruth and Naomi would have returned back to, along with these areas of fields. It's very possible these particular fields are near where the fields of Boaz were, where Ruth was picking up the grain at the harvest time, but this is part of Bethlehem today. As the nation continues to grow, the people demand a king, and so we are in the region of 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, 1 Kings, 2 Kings, and 1 Chronicles, 2 Chronicles. So we're talking about the kingdom age that comes in as the people of Israel want a king, and so Samuel was that transition. So we have this particular account. So the very first king of Israel is King Saul, and at the end of 1 Samuel chapter 31, we have the account of the death of King Saul in the Mount Gilboa region of Israel. And so in chapter 31, the first 4 verses, we have, "Now the Philistines fought against Israel, and the men of Israel fled from before the Philistines and fell slain on Mount Gilboa. Then the Philistines followed hard after Saul and his son, and the Philistines killed Jonathan, Abinadab, and Meshus, and Saul's sons. The battle became fierce against Saul. The archers hit him, and he was severely wounded by the archers. Then Saul said to his armor-bearer, 'Draw your sword and thrust me through with it, lest these uncircumcised men come and thrust me through and abuse me.' But the armor-bearer would not, for he was greatly afraid. Therefore Saul took a sword and fell on him." So we have the suicide of King Saul there on the region of Mount Gilboa, along with his 3 sons. And so this is a particular region. This is also, it's heading up into northern Israel near the Jordan River. So King David, he becomes so David, the shepherd boy, the son of Jesse, also from the region of Bethlehem, who is also part of the lineage that came from Ruth and Boaz, becomes the next king of Israel. And so the city of David is a region of Jerusalem that basically would have been the area where the city was at the time of the reign of David. And so it's a great archaeological site there to be able to see this. And so just to give a little perspective, so this is looking at the modern city of Jerusalem from the Mount of Olives. So to sort of give you an idea where certain things are as we go into talking a little bit about Jerusalem. In this particular area, this is the Eastern Gate, and this will come up more as we go into the New Testament, but this is looking at some of the ancient walls around Jerusalem. This is the region of the city of David over here in this particular area, and this is where that archaeological site is. This is the Temple Mount, and that's approximately where Solomon's temple was, and eventually, when we get into the New Testament, Herod's temple, and that's the Temple Mount over here. So this is the most critical part of the landscape of Jerusalem at this point in time. So the Temple Mount area, and this is basically a view, and this is looking west from the Mount of Olives to the city of Jerusalem. So this just sort of gives you a perspective of where certain things are. This over here, this particular part of the Temple Mount area is Mount Moriah. And Mount Moriah, if going back to the story of Abraham and Isaac, when Abraham was commanded by God to take Isaac, his only begotten son, and to offer him as a sacrifice on Mount Moriah, it is believed that this is the location of Mount Moriah. And so the temple was built near the place where Abraham was about to offer his son Isaac, but God provided a ram in the thicket. So this is the Temple Mount. So David becomes king. He wants to build a temple to God, but because he's a warrior, God told him he could not. David purchased this particular piece of land, and this is where the temple was. Today it is occupied by the Dome of the Rock Mosque on that particular site, but this is the Temple Mount site, and here I am on this Temple Mount area, and just a few other shots of this particular monument. So here we have the Western Wall, or the Wailing Wall, which is a very prominent location for all of Judaism as well as Christianity. So this is the retaining wall of the Temple Mount, and this is obviously on the western side of the Temple Mount area where Jewish people go to pray, but also Gentiles are able to go and pray. And basically, when we look at the rock face here, we start looking at the different kinds of rock that are here. The larger ones and below represent ones that are more original, that they're there from 2,000 years ago, whereas the ones that are closer to the top are more newer ones that have been placed there. But lower ones were probably there 2,000 years ago. And the reason this place is so special and so important is that this is the closest that they can get to where the most holy place was, the Holy of Holies, where the Ark of the Covenant was. Because on the other side and on the Temple Mount, where they're not permitted to go to at this time, where the mosque is where the most holy place was, the Holy of Holies, where the Ark of the Covenant was. So they go to this place because it's the closest that they can physically get to where the Ark of the Covenant was. And one of the places that you can go to that you can really see this history come alive is one of the tours that you can take. It's called the Western Wall Tunnel, where you can actually go behind the walls. And looking down through this one piece of plexiglass and look down into this area, this down here is actually are parts of the baths that were used for washing the instruments of the temple at the Temple Mount site. Because the city of Jerusalem, the way that you see it today, isn't necessarily the way that it was being seen at the time that Jesus was there. To actually see what it looked like 2,000 years ago, you have to go about 10-20 feet below ground, which is why it's nice to go into these Western Wall tunnels, because you can see some of the archaeological digging that's taking place to reveal some of these areas in and around the Temple Mount site. So this is looking on the top of the Temple Mount. Once again, as we saw some of those images, this is looking east. And so that one image that we were looking at that showed the city of Jerusalem, that was taken from over here. And so this is the Mount of Olives over here, and this is looking east from the Temple Mount. So this is looking from the Temple Mount, looking east to the Mount of Olives. And this is one of the exterior walls to the city of Jerusalem. So King David was the king. He built the nation along with Solomon, who built the temple. But then there was a time where the nation was divided. You had the southern kingdom of Judah, which included Jerusalem, and then you had the northern kingdom of Israel. And at different points in time, both nations were not serving God at different points in time, and you can read about that through the First Kings, Second Kings, First Chronicles, Second Chronicles, eventually leading to both of them being exiled. And you can read about them in the different prophets of the Old Testament. Different prophets would prophesy to the northern kingdom, others to the southern kingdom, but ultimately the northern kingdom of Israel would be kicked out and taken into exile by the Assyrians, and the southern kingdom of Judah would be exiled to Babylon. And part of it was because of the idolatry that was taking place. So in the book of First Kings, we have this particular event that takes place where there's this duel between Elijah and the prophets of Baal. And it says in 1 Kings 18:19, now therefore send and gather, and this is Elijah talking to King Ahab. He says, send and gather all Israel to me on Mount Carmel, the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asherah who eat at Jezebel's table. So we have this particular duel, and I would encourage you to read the entire account that takes place there in chapter 18. They build altars. Elijah says, to cry out to them. He makes fun of the prophets of Baal because nothing happens. They basically say don't bring any fire, but cut up your sacrifice. And then cry out from morning to noon, and see who whose God brings down the fire. And the prophets of Baal are never able to get a fire for the sacrifice. Elijah he prays to God. And coming down to chapter 18, verse 39, and it came to pass at the time of the offering of the evening sacrifice that Elijah the prophet came near and said, and this is after he drowns the sacrifice with water. So there's a whole bunch of water. There's a drought in the land, so they have to go all the way to the Mediterranean Sea to get this water. But he offers a prayer and he says, Lord God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known this day that you are God in Israel, and I am your servant, and that I have done all these things at your word. Hear me, O Lord, and hear me, that this people may know that you are the Lord God, and that you have turned their hearts back to you again. Then the fire of the Lord fell and consumed the burnt sacrifice, and the wood, and the stones, and the dust, and it licked up the water that was in the trench. Now when all the people saw it, they fell on their faces, and they said, The Lord, He is God, and the Lord, He is God. And Elijah said to them, Seize the prophets of Baal, do not let one of them escape. So they seized them, and Elijah brought them down to the brook Kishon and executed them there. So we have all these events taking place on Mount Carmel. The prophets of Baal trying to get their gods to bring the fire, and Elijah who is praying to the one true God. And so this picture, as well as the next series of pictures, take place at Mount Carmel, and you'll see how big the view is from this particular location. So this is looking from Mount Carmel. It's a massive, you have a massive vista looking out into this particular area. And as you can see, no matter where you were, even if they weren't physically on the mountain, they would have seen the sacrifice, the fire coming down. Now it's kind of hazy on this day that we were there, but you could almost see to Jerusalem. So everybody in northern Israel is pretty much going to be able to see this particular sacrifice take place and see the fire come down. And so this is from Mount Carmel. Here's another a view looking from Mount Carmel. Now, after Elijah does this particular sacrifice, and this takes place, he actually flees, and he goes to a cave, which is believed to be near where the port city of Haifa is. And this is a view of the modern city of Haifa, sort of in northern Israel, but on the Mediterranean coast. That water there is the Mediterranean. And it's believed that he went there, and there's a church there that's dedicated to Elijah, and it's believed that this is the cave that he was in, and this takes place in 1 Kings chapter 19. And there's a painting that's there on the ceiling of this cathedral. Now, the other things that take place in northern Israel is that there was sacrifices. So this is up once again in northern Israel. This is actually close to the same place where the Canaanite gates were that I showed you when talking about Abraham. It's actually in that same region there. And so there's this particular area where they do sacrifices. And so these areas have been rebuilt where some of these events took place. And so we have a well there. And then this particular metal structure here, this particular structure, and you can see it based on the size of the people that are standing here. And they're, close to 6 feet tall. This is a replica of how large the altars were to Baal. So these altars are not small by any means. They're over 6 feet tall, about 6.5 feet tall. And so this is a replica of what the size was of these particular altars here in this region of northern Israel. And here's some more of this particular site in northern Israel. And just remember, these particular sites are you're going up to these particular sites, and they're over 3 millennia old. And it's just mind-boggling as you're going to some of these areas to be able to see these particular sites that are 2, 3, 4 thousand years old. And it is amazing just to be able to see these particular areas and what's been preserved. So here we have this particular site, and as you can just sort of see the rocks that are of this particular site, and they've been excavated by archaeologists. And now one of the kings was Hezekiah. He was the king in the southern kingdom of Judah, and we have these particular accounts talking about some of the things that he did toward the end of his life. And so this is from 2 Kings 20:20. Then we'll also have an account from 2 Chronicles of the same event. It says, "Now the rest of the acts of Hezekiah, all his might, and how he made a pool and a tunnel and brought water into the city, are they not written in the books of the Chronicles of the kings of Judah?" And then over in 2 Chronicles 32:30, we have the same event talked about. This same Hezekiah also stopped the water outlet of Upper Gihon and brought the water by tunnel to the west side of the city of David. Hezekiah prospered in all his works. And so one of the places that you can actually go to as you visit the city of David is this particular site, the Hezekiah's water tunnel. And you actually go down a set of metal stairs into this region. And if you want to, it can be sort of like a water park because part of it is still flooded, or you can take a somewhat dry tour. There's 2 tunnels now. And so these tunnels are lit, and they're very interesting to go through. But when you think about it, these particular carvings here were done by hand, and they were done during the time of King Hezekiah. Think about that. This is over 2 millennia ago, and you're walking through these tunnels that were carved by hand by people at the time of King Hezekiah. This is when you're in the land of Israel, you see and you touch the Bible in new and exciting ways. So here you are in these tunnels. They're illuminated obviously by modern lights, but you're able to see these carvings on the wall and realize that people did this over 2 millennia ago. And here we are walking through Hezekiah's water tunnel, as you can see. But just amazing to be able to be in these particular locations and going through here to see everything that has been carved out. Another king of Judah was that of King Josiah, and we read about him in 2 Kings chapter 23, verses 28 through 30. So 2 Kings 23 talks about his death. So 28 through 30 talks about his death in battle. "Now the rest of the acts of Josiah, all that he did, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Judah? In his days Pharaoh Necho, king of Egypt, went to the aid of the king of Assyria, to the river Euphrates. And King Josiah went up against him, and Pharaoh Necho killed him at Megiddo when he confronted him. Then his servants moved his body in a chariot from Megiddo, brought him to Jerusalem, and buried him in his own tomb. And the people of the land of Jehoiakim the son of Josiah anointed him and made him king in his father's place." So here we have the valley of Megiddo, and it's a very fertile area in Israel. It's still used for farming, and so this is the valley of Megiddo. And obviously this is an area that plays a role later on as well. So this is looking out to the valley of Megiddo from this particular tell, which is a monument. And so this is looking out toward the valley. So this whole area here is the valley of Megiddo. It's a beautiful, beautiful region. Very fertile. So one of the other prophets that's talked about in the Old Testament is the prophet Jonah. And if you remember from the story of Jonah, as he's running away, not wanting to go to Nineveh to tell the people to repent, he goes and boards a ship in Joppa, and Joppa is also referred to as Jaffa in Israel, and it's the region in and around the modern city of Tel Aviv, where we actually flew into on our trip. And so this is some pictures of modern day Tel Aviv, which is in and around the area of Joppa, where Jonah went on his ship. And then sort of to talk about another story that takes place after the Babylonian exile is the story of Esther and the almost Holocaust that took place during that particular reign of Xerxes and Queen Esther. But when you're in Israel, another place that sort of reminds you of this story is when there was a Holocaust that took place in the 20th century, and just in our recent history, where millions of Jews were murdered. And this particular place, the Holocaust History Museum near Jerusalem, is a sobering location to go to, and it's heart-wrenching, and it just takes your breath away. But this is a powerful place to visit and to remember about the atrocities of the human imagination, the same kind of atrocities that Haman wanted for the Jewish people because of Mordecai did go to pass in the 20th century. So it's a very powerful place to go and visit and reflect on those lives that were lost as a result of this event. So as the Old Testament closes out, the people are returning back. Malachi is the last book in the Old Testament. But between the Testaments, between the Old Testament and the New Testament, there are 400 years. And you need to think that this is a long chunk of time. Think the Jamestown colony in Virginia to now is approximately the same amount of time between the end of the Old Testament and the beginning of the New Testament. So that's a chunk of time. So there's a lot of things that took place in that particular period of time, including Alexander the Great and Antiochus Epiphanes or Antiochus IV, and then eventually the Roman Empire coming in. So one of the places to go to in Israel to sort of look at this is the mountain fortress of Masada, which is in the mountains near the Dead Sea. And this was built as a fortress for Herod the Great. And so you take a cable car up to the top, and this is a recreation of what it probably looked like at its prime when it was newly built. But it's amazing to see what is still left. Particularly, we're going to look. I want you to remember this particular structure here, and possibly this structure as well. It's one of these two that you'll see here in just a little bit, as we look at some images of this mountain fortress. So this is the view, and when you're in the Dead Sea, The Dead Sea region is actually way below sea level. It's about 1,300 feet, 1,400 feet below sea level. It's the lowest place on Earth, meaning on like land. And so this, when you take a cable car or you hike up to the top of Masada, you're actually going up to sea level. And so this is a view from the top of Masada. And remember that structure that I was telling you about? Well, here you have that structure as you're looking down. And remember, this was built about 2 millennia ago. And there's this particular porch that was built off of the side of that. And here we have some more views of looking out. You can see the Dead Sea in the distance there. And the other thing that's amazing is, remember, this is, as I said, this is 2,000 years old or older, actually, and there's still original paint. And if you see these black lines, several different archaeological sites throughout Israel, basically anything that's above these particular black lines are recreations. So they're basically that they're there to preserve the integrity of the structure. But anything below it is original to that particular place. And so here we have blue and red paint that are still on the walls. And you can sort of see a little bit of yellow in there as well. And remember, this was painted over 2 millennia ago, and it's still there. So as I mentioned, the Romans came in, and they built many Roman cities. This is a Roman city near the Mount Gilboa region. It's called Bet Shean, and over here we have the amphitheater. Over here we have a bathhouse, and you have an avenue that goes through here, and just different structures for houses, for businesses that are all in this particular region. And just a few more views of this as we see there. So all this is set up to prepare the way of the Lord as we begin the New Testament. So obviously we begin with the birth of Jesus Christ in Bethlehem. We looked at Bethlehem talking about Naomi, Ruth, and Boaz. But here's a couple other views of Bethlehem, the region where Jesus was born. So this is also Bethlehem. These are some of the modern buildings there in the region. So when Jesus was born, the angels announced the birth of Jesus Christ to the shepherds in the field, and here we have the chapel of the shepherds' field, built on the traditional location of the field where the shepherds were at the time of the birth of Christ. And here's some paintings inside of that chapel. Now, one of the things that I thought was interesting that I learned when I was there, we always have this image that the sheep were out on the hillside, and the shepherds were watching them. But one of the things that you realize when you're in Israel is that there's a lot of caves. Caves are a very big thing that are in Israel. And so one of the things I learned is that what they would do, the Bedouin shepherds, is that they would put sheep into these caves at night, and then they would have a fire outside of these caves to protect them. And so there was a good chance that when the shepherds were watching their sheep, that the sheep were in caves, and they have these smaller chapels that were built in these caves that are in and around the shepherds' fields. This is the church of the Holy Nativity, and this is the church is the traditional location of where the birth of Jesus took place. And you go down. It takes a long time to get into this grotto area, going down the stairs. And this is the traditional location of where the birth of Jesus Christ took place. And so that's one of the places that you can visit while you're in Bethlehem, is the traditional location of where Jesus is born in this grotto. This is just something kind of funny. When you're going through the streets of Bethlehem, you have a Starbucks ripoff. You have Star and Bucks Cafe, and it sort of looks like a Starbucks logo, but it's actually not. But that's just a funny thing to see sometimes on the streets of Bethlehem. Near Jerusalem, there's this particular location that's believed to be a location where the Magi stopped when they were searching for baby Jesus as well. So as we're looking into the narrative, this is another location. One of the areas where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found in 1947, 1948 is Qumran. And this is also in the Dead Sea region. This is sort of near where Masada is, and this is the cave. This hole right down here. This is the hole where the Isaiah scroll was found, and where several other scrolls were found in the caves in jars. And it's believed by some that this is a region that the Essenes, the people of Qumran, is a group that John the Baptist was with before he went out to the Jordan to start baptizing people. So there's a closer view of the Isaiah scroll area, the cave there. But there's hundreds of caves, and it's very possible that there's still caves that have scrolls in them that were hidden that haven't been found at this point in time. But these are an area around Qumran. And so John the Baptist, as we go into the New Testament, went out baptizing in the Jordan River. And while this isn't the region of the Jordan River where John the Baptist was doing his baptizing, this is a region where you can come and be baptized. So it's a beautiful little region that's been set up for people to come and baptize, and you can actually be baptized in the Jordan River if you'd like to be baptized in the Jordan River while you're in Israel. And so it was written about him, it was prophesied by the prophet Isaiah, a voice of one crying in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make his path straight. And so people then, Jerusalem, all Judea, and all the region around the Jordan went out to him and were baptized by him in the Jordan, confessing their sins. Now, baptism isn't something that was part of the Jewish religion. It was something that came up during the intertestamental time, and it was a way for Gentiles that became believers in the one true God to become proselytes. And so this particular ceremony also went into to baptizing those that are repenting of their sins. In John's Gospel, we have an event as Jesus begins his ministry of a wedding in Cana, where the wine is created from the water that's in the jugs. So we have the wedding runs out of wine. Jesus has them fill up pitchers of water, and it turns to wine. So this church in Canaan is believed to be the area where this particular wedding took place. And this is to give you an idea of what these jars sort of look like in this particular region. Now, where Jesus started his ministry was in the city of Capernaum. And this is on the north shore of the Sea of Galilee, or the Lake of Galilee. And Capernaum is a town that's been destroyed by an earthquake, and it's been excavated over the years. Jesus actually prophesied that Capernaum would be destroyed, and it definitely was destroyed. And what's been rebuilt is an archaeological site that's there on the Sea of Galilee. So here we have like a map looking at some of the areas around Capernaum. Now, this particular thing is underneath a chapel, and the reason this area is so prominent and that there's a church built on it is that this is believed to have been the Apostle Peter's house that we read about. This is there's a chapel that's built on top of it, and in Matthew's Gospel, chapter 8, verse 14, it says, "Now when Jesus had come into Peter's house, he saw his wife's mother lying sick with a fever. So he touched her hand, and the fever left her, and she arose and served them." It is believed that this actually is the house of Peter. It's a traditional location, and so there's a church built over top of the ruins of what is believed to have been his house. And so these are a couple images of his house. Right next to his house is the ruins of the synagogue. So we have Jesus preaching in the synagogue. Some people say that this particular synagogue is the one from 2 millennia ago, but most believe that this is actually a much later synagogue that was destroyed, but it was built on the foundation of the synagogue that actually Jesus preached in while he was in Capernaum. So this is the synagogue, and this is right next to the Sea of Galilee. So here we have the synagogue looking out, and you can see the Sea of Galilee there in the distance. And so as we turn the video, you can see the Sea of Galilee, and there we have the chapel built above Peter's house. So that structure, that modern structure, is the chapel that's built above the ruins of the Apostle Peter's house. We see illustrations about millstones in the New Testament when Jesus is doing parables. This is what a millstone looked like 2,000 years ago. It really hasn't changed much if you've ever been to a place where they have millstones for doing wheat or some other kind of grain. But here's one that's in Capernaum of a millstone. In Matthew's Gospel, we have the Sermon on the Mount in chapters 5, 6, and 7, talking about the Beatitudes on the Sermon on the Mount. And one of them is, "Blessed are those who are persecuted for the sake of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." And it's believed that this particular mount, where we're talking about the Sermon on the Mount, is where this took place. So this is the view from this hillside that's believed to have been the location of where the Sermon on the Mount took place. And now this is on the west side of the Sea of Galilee. So we have the Sea of Galilee, then we have across there is the east side of the Sea of Galilee, and that would be like the land of the Gerasenes in that particular looking across there. But this is an area that's near Capernaum, and that looks across the Sea of Galilee. Here's another view of it from this particular mount. It's absolutely breathtaking when you're up there to be able to see it and to just be there and realize that this is a place where Jesus taught and spoke. And here's another view. Now, the Sea of Galilee is really just a lake. We always call it the Sea of Galilee, but it's basically a large lake. It's not even one of the largest lakes in the world, but it is a decent-sized lake. If you've ever been to the Finger Lakes region, is where I grew up, and it very much reminded me of the Finger Lakes region in terms of the lake itself, even though we don't really have mountains on either side. But this is a view of the Sea of Galilee. And one of the things that we were able to do is to go out onto the Sea of Galilee, or the Lake of Galilee, on a boat. And this is looking toward the city of Tiberias. So John also refers to it as the Sea of Tiberias. This is modern day Tiberias, built above ancient Tiberias there on the Sea of Galilee. But it's absolutely amazing to be out there on this beautiful water. and realizing while the buildings that are out there obviously have changed in 2,000 years, the landscape really hasn't changed very much in those 2,000 years. That pretty much the way that it looks here, if you take away the buildings, is the same kind of view that Peter and Andrew and James and John would have seen as they were out in their fishing boats, and they would have seen when they were out there on the lake fishing. And here we have like a hillside that probably really hasn't changed very much in 2,000 years, and realizing that's pretty much the same view that that Jesus and the disciples had while they were out on their boats. And here's another video looking at the beauty that's all around Israel. And this is looking west from the east side of the Sea of Galilee. So this picture was taken as we were traveling on the east side. So it would have been basically the land of the Gerasenes when you're reading about the land of the Gerasenes in the Gospels. And then another view of the Sea of Galilee. And there I am out there on the sea, on the boat. Now this is in a museum that's sort of near Capernaum, and this is showing what a first century fishing boat would have looked like, and they're not very big. They're I would say they're about 15 to 20 feet long and only a few feet wide. And so you can imagine when you're reading about the storms that took place in the Gospels, where the storm arose and then Jesus rebuked the storm and told the disciples, where is your faith? These are pretty small boats, and so you can imagine what the fear would have been being out in one of these based on the sizes of them. And so this just sort of gives you an idea of the size. They're really not that big. And then you can imagine when they're doing fishing and all the fish getting in there. But this is what a fishing boat size was in the first century. Now going back to Jerusalem, so this is a model of what Jerusalem looked like 2,000 years ago with Herod's temple. This is at the museum of that's in Jerusalem, and this basically is a model of what the city and the temple look like. So this is to give you an idea of where things are, and just to sort of give an outline of what everything looks like. So this is what modern day Jerusalem looks like. Once again, this is from the Mount of Olives, just to give you a perspective of where things are. We'll look at the same diagram that we looked at when we were going to Eastern Gate. That's here in this particular area. The city of David, and this is one of the entrances that people would go. And then up here you have where the temple was. So this is the view that that people would have. Again, this is Jerusalem. Once again, the Temple Mount, the Wailing Wall. So these are all areas that are close to where the account of the Passion Week really come in. Here we have once again the Wailing Wall there in Jerusalem. These people are going and praying. Remember, the lower stones are more likely to have been there. You can see sort of the top stones there are very different in characteristics. As you go up the wall, they become newer and newer. The lower you go, the more ancient they are. still many celebrations that take place in and around the Wailing Wall, and this was a bar mitzvah that was going on there while we were at the Wailing Wall. So it's just amazing just to see, you have the modern technology that's around, the cameras, the cell phones, and yet you're still having these ancient traditions, like the bar mitzvah, taking place here at this site that is over 2 millennia old. And so you have the modern with the ancient. And once again, going down underneath the Wailing Wall area into the Western Wall tunnels, this is a great place to be able to see what Israel and what Jerusalem looked like 2 millennia ago. And just to see these mammoth stones, those stones that are at the very bottom there that I started with, were built or put in place around the time of Alexander the Great, or at least around the time that the Greek occupation was taking place. Mammoth stones, several tons. And so this is as you go down into the Western Wall tunnels. And just remember, these are probably some of the stones that the disciples of Jesus and Jesus himself actually saw as they were walking by the Temple Mount. And you can still see some of the Greek lettering. This is the name Luke that's actually upside down, and one of the stones there as you're walking through the Western Wall tunnel. This particular stone was started to be carved out to be part of the Temple Mount, and it was believed that this was started around the time that Herod the Great died. And it was never finished, so it was left in progress. So it's been basically frozen in time for over 2 millennia. And this is walking through a Roman aqueduct that's part of the Western Wall tunnel. This leads to a water source where there was like a Roman bath, but this is an old Roman aqueduct that you go through. Now, as Jesus is talking his disciples, we have this event that takes place in Matthew's Gospel, chapter 16, starting in verse 13. It says, "When Jesus had come to the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, 'Who do men say that I, the Son of Man, am?' And so they said, 'Some say John the Baptist, some say Elijah, and others Jeremiah or one of the prophets.' And he said to them, 'But who do you say that I am?' Simon Peter answered and he said, 'You are the Christ, the Son of the living God.' Jesus answered and said to him, 'Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And I also say to you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades shall not prevail against it. And I will give you the keys to the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose here on earth will be loosed in heaven.' And he had commanded his disciples that they should tell no one that he was Jesus the Christ." So this is the area of Caesarea Philippi where this particular event takes place. And this was an area that was had a lot of pagan religions, and so each of these windows here would have had an icon, would have had an idol in it. And so there was all this false religion that was taking place here in this area of Caesarea Philippi. And this particular cave here is called the Gates of Hades. And so this area, when Jesus is talking about that and saying that the gates of Hades shall not prevail against it, not just the gates of hell or the gates of death, but the gates of this false religion or any false religion, that the rock, the statement that Jesus is the Christ, that he is the Messiah, that everything else would fall from there. And so here we have the gates of Hades, where this particular area, this particular conversation took place. Now, as we enter into the Passion Week, and looking at the death, the burial, and resurrection. This is a traditional location of where the Last Supper took place. Obviously, this building is much newer than the time of the Last Supper, but this is a traditional location in Jerusalem where the Last Supper took place, this particular region. And it was at this Last Supper that that communion took place, at the Last Supper, where the Passover meal. And one of the great things in being in Israel is to take communion with other believers. And I will tell you where this particular region was, where we had communion in Israel in a little bit, because it's a really nice place to be able to have communion. But to the Last Supper, where Jesus took the bread and took the wine, and he said, "This is my body, which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." And he took the cup, the third cup of the Passover meal, the cup of redemption. And he says, "This cup is the New Testament, the new covenant in my blood. Do this as often as you drink it in remembrance of me." And so he had the Last Supper, remembering what he was going to do, the sacrifice on the cross, that he was going to give himself to pay for our sins. After the Last Supper that Jesus had with his disciples, they went to the Mount of Olives, where there's a garden, the Garden of Gethsemane, where Jesus would be praying. And many of these olive trees that are here in the Garden of Gethsemane are very old, and the root systems probably go back to that time that Jesus was praying in there, asking, "If this cup can pass from me, not my will, but your will be done." And it was in this particular garden, the Garden of Gethsemane, that Jesus would be betrayed by Judas Iscariot and be taken to the court of the high priest Caiaphas and Ananias. So this is the Garden of Gethsemane there on the Mount of Olives. And here's a picture looking into the garden. There's also a church that was built near the Mount of Olives. It's all part of this, of the Garden of Gethsemane chapel that's there. So after Jesus was arrested in the garden, he was taken to the court of Caiaphas and Ananias, the high priest. And so this is a view from that particular location. So this is a view from Caiaphas's house. Here we have where the Garden of Gethsemane is, and this is the Mount of Olives, where Jesus would preach from and would go through. The Mount of Olives is basically a giant cemetery, and it's still used to this day. But this is the view from Caiaphas's house. And over here is the Temple Mount. So Caiaphas's house is kind of near where the Temple Mount is, where where Herod's temple was. And here's another view. There's another structure that's built upon the foundation of Caiaphas's house, this church here. This pathway that you see below is original to this area. So this pathway was put in place over 2 millennia ago. It's not open to visitors anymore, but this is a path that they probably would have led Jesus up to Caiaphas's house. And then this is the structure that they would have put Jesus in, is a prison holding cell as the deliberations went on. So this is also the place where in the Gospels we have the denial from the Apostle Peter, where he's asked, that you are also with him, and Peter denies him 3 times, which is an event that took place during the Last Supper. Jesus told Peter that he would deny him 3 times before the rooster crowed. And while I was standing on this particular area near where this statue is, there wasn't anyone else around. Most of our other group was further away, and in the distance I actually heard a rooster crow, and I never heard any other roosters crow while I was in Israel, but on that one day at that one location, I heard it crow, and it just makes you think, how many times have I denied Christ in some way, shape, or form? So I was like, boy, I feel just like Peter right at the moment, being there at Caiaphas's house and hearing the rooster crow. So after Jesus was tried, he was taken to Pilate, and then eventually to Herod, and then back to Pilate, who eventually ordered his execution through crucifixion. He was beaten and bruised, spat upon, and then forced to carry his cross to the place of the skull, also known as Calvary. And this is one of the traditional locations, or actually it's more of a newer location since the 19th century, the 1800s, that's believed to be the place of Calvary. Now, through some of our hymns and some of our traditions, we talk about Calvary being like on a hill. On a hill far away stood that old rugged cross. Well, that's very inaccurate. So the Romans, when they would execute people, particularly by crucifixion, they would put the crosses up near the road, so that people, when they were going by, they would see the people being crucified there. And if you remember from the Gospels, as Jesus is being crucified, that Pontius Pilate has a sign made. This is over in Luke's Gospel, chapter 23, and where it says, in verse 38, it says, "And an inscription was also written over him in the letters of Greek, Latin, and Hebrew. This is King of the Jews." So there's this particular thing. So basically it would show the crime. So on either side of him, you had criminals that were also hanging on the either side of Jesus, and they would have had something that would have said murderer or thief, and it was to basically be a warning to those that were on the road that you don't want to end up like this person that's hanging on the cross for doing whatever that crime was. So this is the location, and it's pretty well thought now that this is the location where Jesus was crucified, referred to as the place of the skull, because of the limestone that sort of eroded away. That these would sort of look like eyes, and I'll show you here in a second what it looked like at the turn of the 20th century. It's sort of crumbled over the years, so it's less and less looking like that. And there's actually a bus garage or a bus parking lot here in this part of Jerusalem. But this is what it would have looked like at the turn of the 20th century. You can sort of see this area here. You can see the eyes, and so from a distance you would be able to see that this was the place of the skull, because it sort of had this kind of look to it, and so this would have been the area where Jesus was crucified. So he was crucified for our sins. He died on the cross. He willingly gave up himself when he died. And then he was buried by Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus in a tomb. And this particular tomb is very special. This is only a few, maybe 100 yards or so away from that location of the crucifixion, because they didn't really have a whole lot of time to prepare Jesus. And if you remember on Resurrection Sunday, that the women were coming back to the tomb because all the preparation wasn't able to be finished before he was buried in the tomb. And so this is the tomb that's right next door to Calvary. And that picture that I showed you earlier on of the communion was a location that's actually between this tomb and Calvary that we had communion. So that was a very special moment. So this is the interior of the tomb, and that was where the body would have been, right there in that corner right there. Most tombs in this particular time period that were made in this time, there are other tombs in the Jerusalem area, but this one is carved where the bodies would have been over toward the right hand side. Most of them are over toward the left in there, if they were actually able to be buried in one of these tombs. And so this is a very unique situation where there's a spot where there could have been a crucifixion. You have this garden that's right next door to it. And over in Mark's Gospel, talking about the account of the resurrection, when the women come over, this is in Mark's Gospel, chapter 16, it says, "But when they looked up, they saw that the stone had been rolled away, for it was very large. And entering the tomb, they saw a young man clothed in a long white robe, sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed." And so the very fact that this particular tomb has a place where the bodies would have been on the right side is a good indication that this is the tomb where Jesus was buried. But he's not there. He is risen. You go to Israel, you spend money to go over there, but the best thing is to see that there's no one in the tomb, that he has rose, and he is no longer there, because he rose just as he said he was. As the angel said to them, "Do not be alarmed. You seek Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He is risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him. But go tell his disciples and Peter that he is going before you into Galilee. There you will see him, as he has said to you." So that's the inside of the tomb. Now this isn't the actual stone that's in front of the tomb, but this is an example of one of the ones that, or about the size of one that would have been on there with the Roman seal. So in John's Gospel, there is an account after Jesus' resurrection about a breakfast on the Sea of Galilee, or on the Sea of Tiberias, as John puts it. And amazing being in a hotel there, overlooking the Sea of Galilee in Tiberias, and having a view of the sunrise. So as we look at that, it talks about the sea. So John chapter 21, it says, "After these things, Jesus showed himself again to the disciples at the Sea of Tiberias. And this is the way that he showed himself. Simon Peter, Thomas called the twin, Nathanael of Cana of Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and 2 others of his disciples were together. Simon Peter said to them, 'I am going fishing.' And they said to him, 'We are going with you also.' And they went out and immediately got in their boat, and that night they caught nothing. But when morning had now come, Jesus stood on the shore, yet the disciples did not know that it was Jesus. Then Jesus said to them, 'Children, have you any food?' They answered him, 'No.' And he said to them, 'Cast the net on the right side of the boat, and you will find some.' So they cast, and now they were not able to draw it in because of the multitude of the fish. Therefore the disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, 'It is the Lord.' Now when Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord, he put on his outer garment, for he had removed it, and plunged into the sea. And the other disciples came in the little boat, for they were not far from land, about 200 cubits, dragging the net with fish. Then as soon as they had come to the land, they saw a fire of coals, and the fish laid on it, and bread. And Jesus said to them, 'Bring some of the fish which you have just caught.' Simon Peter went up and dragged the net to land, full of large fish, 153. And although there were so many, the nets had not broken. Jesus said to them, 'Come and eat breakfast.' Yet none of the disciples dared ask him, 'Who are you?' knowing that it was the Lord. Jesus then came and took bread and gave it to them, likewise the fish. Now this is the third time Jesus showed himself to his disciples after he was raised from the dead. So it's just amazing being out looking over the Sea of Galilee and realizing this might have been the same view that the disciples had on that morning when they had breakfast with Jesus by the Sea of Galilee. So after Jesus was raised from the dead, he ascended back into heaven, and they went up to the Mount of Olives, that location that I've been showing you several pictures both from and looking toward. So on the Mount of Olives, there's this monument here, and this is the location where Jesus went back into heaven. And he tells his disciples in Acts chapter 1, "But you shall receive power when the Holy Spirit has come upon you, and you'll be witnesses to me in Jerusalem, and in all Judea, and Samaria, to the ends of the earth." Now when he had spoken these things, they watched as he was taken in a cloud, and received him out of their sight. And while they looked steadfastly toward heaven, as he went up, behold, two men stood by them in white apparel. And they said to them, "Men of Galilee, why do you stand gazing into heaven? The same Jesus who was taken up from you into heaven will so come in like manner as you saw him go into heaven." So they returned to Jerusalem from the mount called Olivet, also the Mount of Olives, which is near Jerusalem, a Sabbath day's journey. So this is the location where Jesus ascended back into heaven. This is part of the original rock, and the acoustics are very good in this particular room for singing in this little chapel. So after Jesus went back into heaven, we have Pentecost in Acts chapter 2, and we have the people spreading out. And in Acts chapter 10, we have this event that takes place in the early church, where there's a Gentile named Cornelius that has a vision, and then the Apostle Paul also has a vision, and Gentiles are brought to the saving knowledge of Jesus Christ. And so this is Caesarea, and this is the location, the area where Cornelius lived, and these are some of the ruins that are left of this particular city on the Mediterranean coast. And you can see some of the structures that are still there. That's the Mediterranean in the background. And so here's just a couple other images of that. So this is all the Caesarea area. We're not exactly sure where Cornelius's house was, but this is the city that he lived in. And then as we go through the New Testament to the very last book of the New Testament, Revelation, we're taken back to a location that we looked at when we were looking at King Josiah, and that is to the valley of Megiddo. And as Revelation chapter 16 verse 16 says, "And they gathered them together to a place called in Hebrew Armageddon." And so this is the valley of Megiddo, where the battle of Armageddon will take place. So this is that same valley that King Josiah died in, but it's also the last battle that'll take place on this earth at the end of the tribulation period. So now we had to pack back up our bags and head back out and fly back to the States. But I hope you've enjoyed your journey as we've traveled to the Promised Land and had this little promenade through the Holy Land, the land of Israel. Have a blessed time celebrating the death, the burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ this year and every day.